should we be training the sellers on the product, or should that be pushed to sales engineering org? I don't know. It's really up to every org to figure that out. But I think if you put the interests of the buyer in the forefront, they would rather have one person that knows everything they need to get answered or helped with or educated about to get their tasks done. And a lot of orgs do delegate some aspect of demoing to the sellers and not just the sales engineers. And then of course there's always the kind of the demo automation platforms like Consensus that help with that too. But it's all about trying to get the buyer what they need as soon as possible in the medium that they need, and to get their jobs done as quickly as possible.
Basic three that you need in order to have a really top-tier sales engineer is a combination of industry acumen, industry fluency. If you're selling to accountants, you need to know accounting, etc., right? Technical acumen. They have to have the deep product technical knowledge. Sometimes that includes coding. Sometimes they have to be an engineer, right, of some description, whether it's coding or it's communications, whatever it is. And the third one is the soft skills, right, the selling skills.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. Now, that was Garin Hess and John Cook. Garin's the founder and CEO of Consensus, and John is the director of demand gen for Consensus. And in our conversation today, we're exploring some of the key findings from Consensus's third annual Sales Engineering Compensation and Workload Report, which digs into all things pre-sales and sales engineering. And we dig into the reasons why, when buyers were spending less time engaging with vendors and pulling them into conversations later in the process, they preferred interactions with sales engineers. We talk about why pre-sales is in greater demand both earlier and later in the buying process, and what that says about the role of salespeople in the future. We dive into the interesting data they found in the research, such as the number of demos that SEs do per week, the number of hours they work. We also get an important topic of SE compensation. We look at the factors that Consensus surfaced in the research that have the biggest impact on sales engineering compensation, such as size of deals they work on. So we get into all of this and much, much more. But before we get to Garin and John, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So thank you for that. And hey, let's jump into it. Garin and John, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Andy. It's awesome to be on the show again.
Yeah, we've been trying to do this for quite a while.
Yeah, trying to schedule 3 people in one meeting you'd think wouldn't be terribly hard, given that it's not in an actual physical room.
Yeah, considering it's virtual, but it's taken us the better part of 9 months to do this. So
it's worth the wait.
I sure hope so. You can tell me afterwards whether you think it was or not. So anyway, for people who maybe aren't familiar with who you, Garin, and you, John, are, tell us about yourself.
Well, so I'm the CEO, and this is Garin, by the way. I'm CEO and founder of Consensus, so you can learn more at goconsensus.com. And Consensus is enterprise software that automates product demonstrations for pre-sales and sales teams. So they build an interactive video library of interactive video demos, and then the pre-sales team does, and then the sales team will send those out and track engagement, discover stakeholders, and that sort of thing. So that's our main work, and we focus a lot on enabling and helping the sales engineering industry in general get better process and interface with sales and help sales and pre-sales work together. And technology is the main way we do that. We do it through a lot of thought leadership too, and that's where this topic comes in. And John Cook, who's on the call, has also been he's been instrumental in pulling this survey and report together over the last few years. So I'll let him introduce himself and maybe the survey a little bit.
Yeah, you bet. So John Cook, I'm the director of communications right now at Consensus, and been with the company for a while. And we launched this initiative back in 2020
Which is an annual report on sort of the state of sales engineering and
Exactly.
Right.
It's the sales engineering compensation and workload report, which is a mouthful for sure, but it really it's very much like a state of pre-sales sort of a report. So we cover everything in the report. That, like I said, 2020 was the first time we did it. We cover everything from salary, OTE, right, on target earnings, whether people are carrying quota, what kind of quota they're carrying, whether they get options, all that kind of stuff on the compensation side. And then we also survey everything from the number of hours they work to the percentage of their demos that are unqualified or underqualified, whether they automate, where they're spending their time, and where they would rather they spend their time. All of this goes into the report, and so it's pretty rich, and it's one of those things where once you see how extensive it is, the immediate reaction we get is, well, can we go deeper, right? Because there's so much here to unpack, and we want to dive right down to our lookalike audiences of exactly my industry, et cetera. Mm-hmm. There's a lot there to see.
Well, the thing about the report is it shines a certain light on the selling process and the buying process that's a different perspective than I think a lot of people probably have. So I just want to dive into it. So there's interesting lines are up front. It's quoting from the report. It says, buyers were spending less time engaging with vendors and pulling them into conversations later in the process. But when they did engage, they preferred pre-sales interaction. So, by definition, anything that takes place before an order is a pre-sales interaction. But I think you have a very specific definition of that, correct?
Right. This is language that is used. It's one of these things where the language kind of defines the tribe, if you will. When you say pre-sales to most people, it sounds like, I don't know, like a business development or an SDR or something like that, something that happens before they get to sales. But pre-sales is a very specific term used by the solutions consulting / sales engineering department to refer to themselves. And so people who are in pre-sales, they know immediately, and it doesn't even sound strange to them, whereas people from outside pre-sales, they got all kinds of strange ideas about what the word means, well, not strange ideas, but reasonable ideas about what the word means. But it's very specific.
Well, it's funny because
this crowd.
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of people, like you say, think it's SDRs, and it's really old school where it came from, because it used to be that in old school technology days back in the 80s and 90s, right, when a lot of the sales engineering started, you do all of this sales work up front to show value, and then to explain the value, and then the pre-sales solution consultant or pre-sales expert, the sales engineer, would come in and do a demo right as the last thing before closing the sale. It was a demonstration of the capability to actually produce the solution that the buyer wanted. That name has stuck around, even though pre-sales, and we'll just call them probably pre-sales and sales engineers throughout this, but sales engineers' role has changed so much over time, and especially in the last few years, the demand, we've seen it stretch across the entire buying process, across the funnel. And this is one of the reasons that we're so into automation, because it's impossible to do everything they're asked to do, and they're getting spread so thin that they're becoming less effective at what they're meant to be doing, which is that consultative discovery and solution consulting.
Sure.
And so that's where all of this workload stuff comes in, to help try to shine a light on how to do all of this better, and help set standards and best practices for the sales engineering industry.
Yeah. I mean, the fact is that, at least in my mind, is that whether you're a sales engineer, solutions consultant, salesperson, if you're talking to the buyer prior to them buying, it's a sales interaction. I mean, it's not. It doesn't happen before sales. But right. I think it's important for the sales engineers and I know many of them are aware of this, and the solutions consultants that, yeah, they are selling, and that, the experience the buyer is having with them is certainly, aggregated into the buyer's opinion of their experiences with the vendor. So
Yeah.
I know they like to sort of hold themselves apart, and there's good reasons for doing that in many cases, but the fact is
I think they're doing that. Yeah, I think they're doing that less and less these days. There's a much tighter collaboration starting to happen, and with sales teams and sales engineering teams, and they are engaged because they're engaged all throughout the buying process now, and like you said, they're buyers actually have reported they want to spend more time with sales engineers and less time with salespeople, which is interesting because they're all engaged in trying to get the deal done. And speaking of the report, and on this, one of the interesting questions is about how they're comped and what are they measured on. And it's been interesting to see there's more and more attention going to measurement of sales engineering on revenue. Not just on the technical win or how many demos they do or those kinds of things.
Which should be.
There's much more alignment. Yeah. And most people we're talking to now in the pre-sales world are all aligned there. But it's interesting, this dynamic between the sales team and the pre-sales team and how that plays out in different cultures and different organizations. But they're absolutely necessary to get the deal done. But quite often in some organizations, they are kept apart.
Yeah. Well, not to get too far ahead of ourselves here, but to the point you were making is saying, hey, buyers want to spend more time with sales engineers than sellers, is really it's not that. What they're saying is we want to spend time with people who can help us get our job done.
And provide value.
Provide value, which is, and our job as a buyer is to make a decision.
Yep.
Right? So if you, a salesperson, can't help me get my job done, I'd rather talk to the sales engineer.
Well, it's an interesting thing because there's it's actually evidenced in the buyer journey, because when we say that they'd often rather speak to a sales engineer, that if you look at the buyer journey, they go to a website. We know from lots of different studies, and Gartner champions this a lot, that buyers are doing much more of their investigative work on their own before they ever interact with vendors, right? I think Gartner cites 17% as the total amount of time they spend with vendors, right? And then you look at that vendor interaction, and what do? They go to the website, and usually the button that they're going to click on is something like book a demo, right? So who did they want to speak to? But that's not the person they got. What they got was a form. Okay, necessary evil. They're going to abuse my inbox, but all right, I got to, because I need a demo. So I'm going to fill out the form. And then do I get a demo? No. I get an SDR. And the SDR is going to ask me a bunch of questions. Am I the decision maker? Do I have the budget? What's the timeline, right? But the band, the qualification, whatever they're going to use. And then do I get a demo? No. Then I don't get a demo. I get a sales rep, and the sales rep's going to talk to me about high-level value adds, and they're going to further qualify me because they have this limited pool of sales engineers, and the people who actually give the demo, they have this limited pool, and they have to throw up these big walls in front of them because they're so stretched. And then if I jump through all of those hoops, I finally get to the thing I asked for when I click that button, and that's a demo. And so and I get to the demo, and then the poor sales engineer is going to try and do a good demo, so they're going to try and do a little discovery, and I'm all discovery fatigued out. I don't want to answer any more questions. And so this is when we talk about who the buyer wants to talk to. By the time they get to the point where they're interacting with sales, they're looking oftentimes for a technical proof. And technical proof isn't, because they've already done their research. They know, they've already narrowed you down to the people they think can do it. And so that technical proof is what's missing for them. Now, it's not the only thing that's missing by any stretch, but it tends to be top of mind.
Yeah. Okay. And there's lots to go back and talk about. I mean, so yeah, I think there's less of that narrowing down that takes place than people think. by that stage. But I mean, let's go back to sort of the big question, which in my mind, the big question, which is, okay, somebody says, yeah, I want to do a demo. They get hit up by an SDR. They get hit up by a salesperson, pre-qualify. Are they qualified for a demo? I hand them over to a sales AE. They'll qualify them again. Just make sure they have the right content in the demo, whatever. Doesn't it really speak to the fact that we're just not hiring the right type of salespeople? I mean, there's this idea that's persisted for a long time that salespeople, and I rail against this in my book and other places, is that salespeople have to this hunter extrovert mentality, and reason we need salespeople is because the SEs, they just don't have the they're all nerds. They don't have the human personality to deal with buyers, and that's all bullshit, right? I mean, I've worked with companies where, I as both a consultant and as a sales leader, I've completely turned over the sales team and hired all engineers as sellers.
Right.
Because
it depends on the type of seller. Yeah.
Well, but it was a complex technical sales, and it's like, well, yeah, I'm going to have to bring along a sales engineer. Why not just hire a salesperson in that instance who's, the sales stuff, that's easy stuff. People know how to be people.
So this is kind of the crux, though, is there still room for a separation of roles between the sales engineer and the AE, right? Is that still valid? And this is actually the thing that we double down on. There's a guy on this call named Garin who wrote a book on this. The whole concept is that the role of, it's not just the roles of the SE getting stretched and more in demand. It's that the role of the seller is actually changing from this hunter, as we often think of them, to a coach, because the buyer journey, the real pain, the friction in B2B sales, especially in any time you're buying software for a team, the friction is actually on the buyer's side and in the buyer's org. And that friction is going to be very painful for them. And the seller is the one who has been through this process, knows where that friction is going to come up because they've been through this process. How many times organizations have they sold into? They know. And so their job is now to coach and enable and reduce friction and prepare and equip, right? And so and now, can a sales engineer do that? They probably can. A sales engineer has a lot of other things they have to know as well. And so a good buying coach paired with the sales engineer, I think is probably where we're headed, where we should be headed.
Yeah, but I wonder whether the buyer has patience for that coach role.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, going back to your question, Andy, about this role of who do we hire? Are we hiring the right types of people? And I agree that the idea is to hire people that provide value and get the right people, and that doesn't necessarily follow the traditional sales line of thinking. And that's where the coaching comes in. But I think there is too much for people to learn to do effectively in many organizations. Not all. Many organizations, it could be handled by one. If you have a simplistic product or even some complex products, and you're willing to go through and teach your sales engineers to be the salespeople, but there are also different personalities, which is interesting. The salespeople tend to be a bit more willing to take risks and have more of their pay, their compensation as variable. And sales engineers, a lot of them kind of drift over into that part of the org, or attracted to that part of the org and that role because they are more risk averse. They want to get in and educate and be helpful and be part of the sales and get comped on some sales, but there's that aspect of it. So it is interesting.
Well, hang on. Before you go on, though, let's talk about the personality part because I'm going to push back on that because I think that sales engineers historically gravitate over to that side because they don't want to be they don't envision themselves as quote unquote salespeople, and they don't want to be labeled as salespeople. And I talk about this in my latest book and that's the point right there, is that people don't understand the job of a salesperson, right? We've spent decades trying to train and socialize sellers to think, okay, your job as a salesperson is to go out and persuade somebody to buy your product and service.
Very interesting point. Yeah.
And that's not the job at all. Yeah. When you do that, when you think your job is to persuade somebody to buy your product or service, this whole idea of understanding them and the things that are really important to them and what they're doesn't really matter. It's almost immaterial, because your job is to persuade them, come hell or high water, to buy your product. Right. This is what leads to the salesy behaviors that make sales engineers and customers cringe, right? I don't want to be that person.
All right. So would you argue that there's no place for quota then?
But hang on. But the job of a seller is really simple. And it's one that engineers are really good at. That's why I hire engineers into sales. The job as a seller is to listen to the buyer, understand the things that are most important to them in terms of the problems they're facing, the challenges they have, and the outcomes they want to achieve by addressing the challenges, and then help them get that.
Yeah.
That's what a sales job is.
And I would add to that sales job is to do all of those things and then also anticipate all of the challenges that the buyer is going to have to get from point A to point B, because the salesperson, and this whether you're a salesperson or sales engineer, you've helped the buyer go through this process dozens of, maybe hundreds of times. This may be the first and only time the buyer is going to go through this journey. They don't necessarily know all of that. So they need to do all of those things and anticipate and map out all the potential pitfalls. And then that's where the coaching comes in and say, hey, here are the tasks to get from here to where you want to be. We've done this 1,000 times with people just like you. And here's the map. And here's how you get there from this point to that point. And by the way, what I recommend doing right now is this. And we've seen this work really well with other people in other orgs. Would you be willing to go and do this at this stage? Because this is what I think is going to help us get there. And that's where the coaching comes in. And you asked a question earlier about, well, buyers take the coaching. And in my experience, buyers love the coaching. They crave the coaching. Buyers, they do not know what they're doing, and they sometimes don't admit it, because salespeople ask ridiculous questions like, what do you think the next step should be? Well, and the buyer has literally no idea. They may think they have an idea sometimes, but it's almost always wrong. And usually they'll come up with something, but it's the seller that knows that path. And I do agree, though, that this blurring of sales engineer and sales is an interesting point or question, because the buyers, a lot of them don't want to talk to a salesperson at all. They feel like it's a necessary evil, but organizations keep them separate. Who sends the price quote? Sales engineer. Who does the demo? Who does discovery? The salesperson sends the price quote. Sales engineer, does the demo. So it is interesting. It could blur into one role. In some ways it maybe should, but yeah, for right now it's clearly separated in most orgs. Yeah,
and I think because we're talking primarily software here, and so we'll sort of stick with this as an example, but yeah, I mean, I see sales engineers in organizations where, quite honestly, the product's not very difficult and not very complex, and it's a crime that somehow an AE punts the demo to a sales engineer, because what they're doing is they're not learning what they need to learn about the customer and the product and how the product provides value to the customer and so on, if they're just handing it off.
Well, it's one of those challenges. Yeah. I was just going to say, it's one of those challenges in our org, because our platform is fairly straightforward. It delivers a lot of value, but not super complicated. And so we're selling into sales engineering, but do we have sales engineers? Well, we actually have one now. Well, why? Why do we have one in our platform? Our salespeople do the demos. Our salespeople do a lot of the same things that the sales engineers would typically do, because precisely for what you said, our solution is not, we don't have 20 product lines and all these things, but we have a sales engineer now who helps with integrations and kind of moving past into the very complex part of how do we get this tied into all these other integrated systems. But yeah, I think in many orgs you don't need sales engineers. or salespeople differentiation in titles. You just need somebody to help the buyer get what they need. To your point.
Well, right. So, but this is one of the key points, and I raise this all the time here, talking to sales leaders, especially in the last year or two. It's like, okay, you're a sales leader, and you're putting together a job description for a position that you want to fill, sales role, and you put the usual crap in there, right? Hunter, extrovert, blah 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 blah. And I'll ask them. I say, okay, well, interesting. So, have you asked your buyers what they need from your sellers in order to get their job done? Have you ever asked your buyers think about it from the context of, buyers are basically, I like this whole jobs to be done theory, right? Is buyers are hiring sellers to help them do their job.
Yep.
Right? So, if that's the case, what attributes, what qualifications, what experiences, not that you need as a selling organization, what does a buyer need from you?
What you seem to be arguing then is not that sales engineers are not who people want to talk to, but that rather you should just have sales engineers. Like there's when we talk about sales engineers and what makes a good one, we talk about a three-legged stool, okay? And it may be an oversimplification. There's some nuance here, obviously, okay? But the basic three that you need in order to have a really top-tier sales engineer is a combination of industry acumen, okay, industry fluency. If you're selling to accountants, you need to know accounting, etc., right?
Right.
Technical acumen. They have to have the deep product technical knowledge. Sometimes that includes coding. Sometimes they have to be an engineer, right, of some description, whether it's coding or it's communications, whatever it is. And the third one is the soft skills, right, the selling skills. And so if you're talking about what the customer needs, that combination of industry fluency so they can speak to their precise needs with the technical acumen.
It sounds like you just described a salesperson. I mean, coding,
but product fluency,
right?
Andy, do you expect a salesperson at, let's say, Salesforce to know the product, on all the product lines? And I guess that's where I'm wondering. Certainly for smaller orgs, it makes sense, but
they don't sell the entire product line either. But you're right. There's certain times when, yes, the product rises sufficient complexity. You need to have sales engineering, for sure. But it's because the salesperson won't necessarily have that in-depth knowledge. But I can guarantee, when it's really complex product, the seller is pretty damn well versed about the product and the industry and so on, because they couldn't have any conversation with the buyer.
They're gonna have the acumen, and like you're saying,
the buyer's gonna say you're just not worth my time at all, right? Why should I invest my time in you? You don't know you don't know anything. I mean, it gets back to this idea that people talk about so openly these days, which I think is wrong, which is that buyers don't want to talk to salespeople. They've never wanted to talk to a salesperson, right?
Suffix that with as presently constituted.
But they need. No, but the fact is they need to talk to salespeople. They need to talk to a sales engineer. They need to talk to somebody in sales because they need somebody to come ask them the questions they don't know to ask themselves, right?
Well, I want to point out an interesting data point from the report that goes right into what we're related to what we're talking about here. Sales engineers sometimes think we could, we're the ones who actually do all the hard work, and the salespeople, they show up and they glad hand and they get the commission check. And then salespeople on the converse side think, the necessary evil of having to get sales engineer, they're never available. And I mean, if only I didn't have to get a sales engineer involved, I could get this deal done anytime. Well, there's one interesting data point from this sales engineering workload report is we asked this question about stakeholders. How many stakeholders are in a deal? And what's fascinating is we asked both, the data coming back from both sales engineers and salespeople is quite different. And so the sales engineers, for example, report 4.8 stakeholders, and AEs are reporting about 11 stakeholders, which is right in line with what Gartner and some of these other organizations are saying. And it just goes to show that the sales engineers don't fully understand all of the complexity that's going on outside of the technical discussions, outside of the solution part. The the salespeople are aware, oh, there are 11 stakeholders out here that I've got to go work with and interact with and bring in one way or another. And the sales engineers aren't always engaged in that. And so you see from some of this data, it's interesting. You see just some of these differences of perspectives of how the deals are even viewed, because you just imagine if a sales engineer is viewing a deal and thinking there's only 5 people that need to get involved to get the deal done, and the salesperson thinks there's 11, it's such a huge difference. So to me, it just shows that there is value being provided from both sides of the house on those deals, at least on those complex deals when you do have a lot of those stakeholders getting involved.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just sort of thinking about that because I made a note about that part from your report. Is yeah, there's big variances, I think, in general between even what sellers think in terms of number of stakeholders involved and what the analysts believe, right? And so, yeah, I think I'm sort of reached the point where I think the analysts' numbers are so overblown that they're starting to lose credibility. But yeah, nonetheless, yeah,
there are a lot of stakeholders. But I guess my point is not how many, what's the right number of stakeholders, but just that there's a difference in perspective of 2x between the sales engineer and the account
well, I think
executives.
they get shielded.
Right?
They get shielded from some of that,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
I mean,
exactly.
I think that's part of it is they've got a more limited scope they're afforded by the seller. And to a point you made before is I think the astute sellers that the deal coaches or however you are calling them is they're making sure the SEs understand what's really going on, right? And that they're involved and not just relegated to this small part of the deal, but they understand the bigger picture because they have a contribution to make on the bigger picture.
But then you have the problem.
One thing I was going to mention is
sorry, just real quick. Then you have the problem of strained resources, right? So we're going to involve the sales engineer more intimately, more kind of joined at the hip throughout the selling process. Maybe not entirely joined at the hip, but we're going to give them a bigger role in every sale, right? And that's going to be a better experience for the customer. It's going to be a better experience all around. We're going to close more deals because it's just a better way to work the sale. But that one sales engineer, according to our numbers, supports on average 4 different account executives. Mm-hmm. I mean, we get up above 15-1 in many orgs. And so now you've got a bit of a misalignment, right? Well, you've got in order to affect that kind of buyer journey and buyer experience, now we need to move more toward maybe a 1-to-1 ratio, right? We need just as many sales engineers as we have account executives, and that's going to directly inflate CAC, right? So if I'm in the C-suite, I'm looking at that number, and my sales engineers, by the way, are expensive, and by the way, they take on average 6 months to onboard. 6 months versus, say, growing a sales team. And
well, how long do you think a salesperson takes?
Not as long.
Really?
Yeah, because they
okay. We're getting a whole different conversation about that.
Just because sales skills are so transferable, whereas their whole technical acumen side, the whole product knowledge side is one of those legs of that stool, is very often not transferable, right? And
right. So how long does it take a seller? Do they learn faster than a sales engineer?
They just have different things to learn, I think, was the only point I was making. They have more transferable skills as opposed to a sales engineer that has to learn everything new with a new product oftentimes.
Well, but I think that was what we were talking about before, is if we go in this with the assumption that we're just going to superficially train our sellers on our product.
Right, exactly.
I think
which is
that question, should we be
oftentimes.
training sellers on the product or not, right? It's like, should we be training the sellers on the product, or should that be pushed to sales engineering org? I don't know. It's really up to every org to figure that out. But I think if you put the interests of the buyer in the forefront, they would rather have one person that knows everything they need to get answered or helped with or educated about to get their tasks done.
Yeah.
And a lot of orgs do delegate some aspect of demoing to the sellers and not just the sales engineers. And then of course there's always the kind of the demo automation platforms like Consensus that help with that too. But it's all about trying to get the buyer what they need as soon as possible in the medium that they need, and to get their jobs done as quickly as possible. And I think sellers more than sales engineers are perhaps more positioned to be that buying coach in some ways because they are aware of all those stakeholders, and sales engineers maybe are not. On the flip side, sales engineers traditionally are, and whether or not they should or shouldn't, salespeople should or shouldn't be, but they're traditionally more solution-oriented as a rule of thumb. At least this is how they think of themselves. Now, you could argue whether it's true or not, but sales engineers think of themselves as more solution-oriented than the sales side of the equation. And so they both have a role to play in this buying coaching, but if you're going to try to pull all the pieces together from all these different stakeholders, so far it's looking like the sales engineers are not fully aware of all that complexity, and it's the salespeople that have to be that buying coach. But we're seeing more and more that sales engineers, as they embrace this concept of buyer enablement, are able to play a more strategic part in the deals they're working on with their sales counterparts, and not only that, but even take some of these concepts of buyer enablement out into the org with more strategic influence into other parts of the org. And so I think all of this, whatever you want to call it, buyer-centric selling and approach, and we call that buyer enablement from our standpoint, that is fundamentally helping move the processes and approaches and models and things together in a way that it should help the buyer. But it'll be interesting to see whether it ends up merging entirely at some point.
Yeah. Well, I guess that sort of begs the question is does it? Because at least in the SaaS world, and this is not exclusively in the SaaS world, study that was done that they reported on in new book from Jennifer Colosimo out of Franklin Covey. They researched or surveyed 14,500 companies, enterprises around the world, buyers and sales organizations. It was like remember this correctly, for deals 100K or higher, ACV 100K or higher, 17% win rate on average, companies report.
Pretty low.
And in the SaaS world, 20% is considered acceptable, and if not good in some companies. So, when win rates are hovering so low, and this is one of my favorite topics to get into, are sales engineers really helping, or would it be worse if sales engineers weren't involved? Are we really, because we're talking about being buyer-centric, are we doing what we really need to be doing as sellers to align with the buyer and how they make decisions? And to a point you made before, I think Garin was, talking about, using the term buyer enablement, and Gartner came up with that in their buyer enablement study that they did with their famous buyer journey diagram. Yep. Their spaghetti diagram, which I found accurate and reflecting of my experience over decades of selling large, complex enterprise systems. I haven't talked to a single sales organization in the last 3 years or 4 years since Gartner put that out, who said, we've really realigned how we're selling to engage with the buyers based on, how the buyers are making decisions.
Well, let me share our experience is that these concepts are making a fundamental difference. So an example, I'll just shout out to Todd Jansen. He's the head of what's called Q Branch at Salesforce. And he, I guess if you don't mind, and since it's been mentioned, I'll mention the book I published was called "Selling is Hard, Buying is Harder."
Oh, no, absolutely. Go
Published
ahead.
a couple of years ago.
Say it again. I
Anyway,
was talking over you.
Yeah, so it's called "Selling is Hard, Buying is Harder," which is a bit of a controversial title, kind of, because
That's a good
selling is
book.
very difficult. But the idea is, it's harder for the buyer because they are only doing it once. As a seller, selling is really hard, but we get to practice it all day long. So we've got to help them figure out how to get through this. In any case, Todd Jansen over there read this book, and it's based on a ton of research, including Gartner and lots of other sources. And for him, that fundamentally shifted a bunch of things. And he went on a warpath to try to change the way selling is happening inside Salesforce, and is actually making some pretty strong headwinds. And they are, and you can imagine a huge organization with over 100,000 employees making this change would be very difficult. But and so I think that some people are just look at that and say, yeah, you're right. It's complex. It's difficult. Oh, well, what can we do? But some people are taking this as a war cry to fundamentally change how sales organizations engage with the buyers. And as just a simple example, there's a little concept that we call selling in the gaps, which is something we talk to our customers about, which is basically, what are you doing between meetings? What are you providing in the spaces between the meetings, and even before that first meeting? Like, how do you engage as many of those stakeholders before that first call, and through all this process, of course, shorten the sales cycle.
Right.
It's not just about how do I become on the calls, how do I be a better buyer coach? It's a complete transformation of understanding deeply what the buyer needs to get done, understanding deeply that they have no idea really how to do it, or at least they're naive about it, let's put it that way. And then being able to adapt your org and your sales motion in a way that it becomes a focus on the buying motion, and it's greasing the skids, right? It's like, how do we get them through this process as quickly and easily as possible? Because buying enterprise software right now is painful, it's slow, and it's so complex. And it really should be simple, pleasant, and fast, right? At least faster. And so I've seen some organizations to the point where some people actually are getting their titles changed. Like, we have two customers where they were heads of presales. Now they've been promoted to global head of buyer enablement. Like, so it's taking hold in some organizations where they are catching this vision that if we just focus on what the buyer needs and do everything, starting even in marketing all the way through client success, just focus on what the buyer needs and how to get it to them as quickly as possible in a prescriptive sort of way, it can change everything. So I guess I would just beg to differ that it's not the graphic, that Gartner came out has changed everything. But I do believe that some organizations are catching the vision of what's possible and trying to make big shifts, and that Gartner analysis,
which is great.
part
No,
of it.
I'm happy to hear that, because like I said, I hadn't encountered any myself. It doesn't mean there aren't any, but it's still so, I would say, argue so small number.
So
I mean,
small.
It's early days, yeah.
In research for my book, I did a lot of research online about selling process, buying process, and so on. And there's always been this, mythology of the modern sales process. And even when you do a lot of research on that, you find out, well, oh gosh, the modern sales process is really the old sales process, just with technology put on top of it. Right? I mean, it's all
in a lot of ways.
Linear stage-based processes they lay out. That
We're going to automate some of this. We're going to get
I
AI on this part, analyze this. Yeah.
Right, but you look at the stages, right? They have sales stages they define, which, to your point about being buyer-centric, buyers don't think in those stages.
No, they don't.
So
Nor do they think of marketing or selling. It's like they don't think
right,
of,
but as long
I'm in
as
marketing now, I'm in selling now.
Right. I mean, as long as buyers and sellers are thinking about the same process with two different vocabularies and two different intents.
Totally agree.
It's problematic.
They're at odds. Boom. Totally agree.
Right. From the beginning. So I part of what fundamentally like the Gartner buyer enablement diagram because I think they got a very accurate reflection of what happens.
Yeah.
But I think there's a way to simplify some of that even. And I like to put together what I think is a buying process that really just has 3 steps in it. And this is what I think, my experience, many, many years, buyers basically go through is they've got I call it the what stage, the how stage, and the who stage. Mm-hmm. And the what stage is just, what's our problem and our challenges, and what can we achieve by addressing them? What are the outcomes we can achieve? And when they're in that stage, they're not looking at products necessarily. They're not looking at vendors per se. It's about ideas, right? It's defining what the challenges they face are. And they need outsiders to come in and help them ask questions so they can think more deeply and broadly about it and the outcomes they can achieve. And this is sort of reflected in the Gartner diagram, the sort of jobs to be done at the middle of it. Then the next stage is how. Okay, we defined what we want to do. Now we're going to go in the market more intently than we've been doing some before, but more intently, and try to understand how we can accomplish these things that we need to accomplish. Then they really do need the help of sellers at that point, right? Because they need to understand, how they can get this accomplished. And
you could argue, you could argue that what they actually go to at that point is a peer. Anybody ever solved this? How did you do it?
Sure.
Right?
Well, they go into the market.
What are the
peers,
tools?
The websites,
this,
all those resources.
And the other, right? And so
exactly.
They're going to go through. They're going to go as long as they possibly can before they say, okay, I hear these tools. These are the ones that I think I need to implement in order something like this. So now it's time to talk to vendors. And so,
I agree.
Know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think they divided into, I said, 3 very simple stages: what, how, and the third order decision, which frustrates salespeople, is who we can do this with. That's sort of the least important of the decisions they have to make. But sellers come in for the most part thinking that that's the most important thing the buyers are focused on, and it's really not.
That's right. There are probably several different ways they can solve their problem.
Yeah. Well, they need to understand the problem first. I can try and think any major, and I've sold large complex systems, 7, 8, sometimes 9-figure deals. The buyer had an idea of what they wanted to do when we first were engaging, but we knew we were going to lose and we'd never win the deal if we didn't have an impact on their thinking about what the challenges they had and what they thought they could accomplish. Right? That's part of your job as a seller.
Framing.
Ask the right questions, provide the right insights, shape the conversation. That had nothing to do with product. And the lesson for me, it was great because I was working for companies that we oftentimes didn't have products. We were selling things that were to be designed. So, I think that this is where it's so critical for sellers to really understand what buyers are doing and where they are at each stage of their process and what their mindset is focused on.
Yeah.
And it's not them and their product initially.
No, it's definitely not. Yeah. In fact, one of the things I like to advocate for is changing your CRM to have buying stages rather than selling stages.
Yes. Yep.
And we have a report that we do inside Consensus with our own selling where we measure, this is for forecasting, we measure the likelihood of a deal based on what the buyer actually does rather than what the salesperson has done or what the salesperson says. So if the buyer has done these 5 things, including engaging these stakeholders, they've done whatever it might be, then they get a certain score.
Right.
And so often, and this is where I think a lot of sales teams do their deal reviews right from a selling centric perspective, where if you just that there's this great story from this book called The Hard Thing About Hard Things, where Ben Horowitz, who's the author, was talking about his VP of sales in one of the companies that he owned at the time was doing this deal review, and he's saying, "Hey, tell me about this deal." And the salesperson says, "Well, we got the champion, we got him. He's super excited. We have this and we have that." And they looked at the quote. He told us they liked the price quote. It went on, and I said, "We're definitely going to close this." And the VP of sales said, "Have you spoken with the head of IT over there?" And he said, "No." He said, "My champion says he likes it, but I haven't spoken with him." He said, and the story, I won't quote it because it's not airworthy the way it was told, but he basically says, "You don't have a deal, right? Mm-hmm. If you think you have this deal, you don't have it." And it's because in that VP of sales mind, he knew that the buyer needed to go get that IT on a call with the seller. They'd known that this was part of the, I guess, an indicator of likelihood to close in this particular company. And without that, it wasn't going to happen. And the buyer can say people are excited or whatever it is, but until the buyer or certain stakeholders on the buying group take those actions, then you can't forecast it in that company. I thought that was a really interesting story, and that wasn't his point when he was telling the story. It wasn't even about that. But I thought it was an interesting story because it shows that that VP of sales had a deep understanding of what are the buyers and the different stakeholders, because they're all buyers, even though we think of the main champion as the buyer. Right. But what do the buyers have to do? What actions do they have to take to actually get the deal done? And the more you can measure that, and the more predictable your sales are going to be.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's a great story. I mean, this type of stuff that needs to be shared, obviously, internally. But I mean, I've got one of my own that I drew up over the years, which was, at least for the businesses I was in, is if the buyer, again, collectively, the buyer, hadn't done their internal business justification on the purchase,
likely to close next to nil.
A deal.
Yeah.
Next to nil, right? Yeah. You're more likely to get a no decision at that point. If it gotten so far down the line where the buyer hadn't done that, then you weren't going to get a decision. Yeah. And for me, that was just one of those things, right? You knew that based on experiences, that had to take place.
We have to talk about
that meant if it wasn't taking place, it means no one internally, none of the stakeholders willing to put their butts on the line to say this is something we should do, and here's the reason why.
And that's the big telling factor, is if they're willing to take the risk. Are they willing to take a risk?
Yeah, the risk.
Yeah.
In order to.
Well, and that becomes, as you know, that's a big part of selling. How do you de-risk opportunities for the buyers? All right. Well, guys, thank you so much. And we didn't cover everything I wanted to cover, but tell people about the report and where they can get it, because I think there's a lot of great data in there.
John, go ahead.
Absolutely. So goconsensus.com, under resources at the top, you'll see the Sales Engineering Compensation and Workload Report. The latest is the 2022, and look for 2023 edition out in January.
Perfect. All right. And individually, if people want to connect with you, Garin?
Yeah, you can reach out on LinkedIn. Happy to connect. And and you can always reach out on our website as well, just if you want to reach out that way. But thanks for having us on the show, Andy. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, great to talk to you again.
Yeah, likewise.
And John, if people want to connect with you.
Absolutely. LinkedIn, I'm a connecting fool on LinkedIn, so go ahead and hit me up, and I'm happy to chat. We talk a lot about pre-sales. We talk a lot about I'm really passionate about it. I love the controversial stuff, and I'm sure we can stir up some trouble together. So hit me up.
All right, perfect. All right, gentlemen, thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. I'm so grateful for your support of this show. And I want to thank our guests, Garin Hess and John Cook, for sharing their insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So thank you for your help with that. And as always, thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.